Got data? That is the question of the day, it seems. There's a pretty good chance that you use data every day to inform decisions that you make for yourself or your family. It's also equally true that we use data to inform decisions for our whole populations, regions, countries, globally. In the midst of this pandemic, our interest in data has never been greater. Welcome to the panel discussion on data and decision-making during the time of disruption. It's hosted by the Agri-food Institute at the University of Guelph. Let me first introduce myself. I'm Jeff Wichtel. I'm the Dean of the Ontario Veterinary College. And let me introduce our panelists today, our University of Guelph experts. Firstly, Dr. Rozita Dara. Rozita is Associate Professor, School of Computer Science. Dr. Amy Greer, Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Population Disease Modeling and Associate Professor, Department of Population Medicine. Simon Somogyi, Arroll Chair in Business of Food and Associate Professor, School of Hospitality, Food and Tourism Management. And Alfons Weersink, Professor, Department of Food, Agriculture and Resource Economics. Let me start with you first, Amy. You're a mathematical modeler for infectious disease, especially much in demand these days. Let me ask you, how important have data been in our response to COVID-19, say compared to previous epidemics or other emergencies?
Yeah, so, we always like to be able to make decisions that are evidence-based. And I think the availability of data in the response to COVID-19 is really super critical. And certainly we've seen some changes since the 2009 pandemic of influenza. For example, a lot of the data sources that are available and that the public, as well as scientists, frequently check in on are publicly available. We have a lot of groups maintaining line lists of data, keeping track of case counts from different public health units across the country, and making really amazing data sharing resources publicly available. And I think that is something that's quite different actually than even in 2009. I think the other really interesting point related to data in the era of COVID-19 is the availability of preprints. As scientists, we engage in this research protocol where we conduct research and then we share our results by way of peer-reviewed publications. And the data on COVID-19, especially because it's an emerging disease, we're learning more and more about it every day. And preprints are kind of an interesting way in which the scientific community are sharing their results very rapidly as a way to get information out, sharing that information publicly with the scientific community, recognizing that those results have not been peer reviewed, but it still allows us to have evidence at our fingertips to be able to assess much more quickly than using more traditional scientific dissemination routes. So it's really quite an interesting scenario that we have not really seen in other public health emergencies.
Thanks, Amy. So a real democratization of data that's going on at the moment. So more specifically with the data that you work with every day, what's it telling us about where we are in this pandemic as a province and as a nation and globally? Are we in a recovery phase as we're often hearing in the news?
So I think the term recovery phase is a bit misleading, if you might. So, what we know about this coronavirus is that it is highly transmissible, and that means it transmits from person to person quite easily. And most of all of the population is susceptible to becoming infected. We also know that it represents a number of extra challenges that we haven't seen with some of the other previously pandemic pathogens like influenza. With coronavirus, we know that transmission can happen before individuals are very obviously ill. And that makes things like contact tracing challenging, because if people are spreading illness before they even know that they're sick, it's very challenging to control an infectious disease that has that sort of biology. So in terms of where we are, what I'll say is that nationally, we use a term called the R0, or the basic reproductive number, to kind of assess disease transmission in a population. we know that that value has been dropping. And that's really good news. What that means is that as a society, we've been engaging in aggressive and early physical distancing to drive contact rates down. And that reduction in contact rate is really starting to demonstrate that we have been effective at slowing transmission. So early in the outbreak nationally, we were seeing a doubling of cases every 3 to 4 days. Now it's more like every 16 days. So that's really good news. The challenge is that we are not out of the woods yet. In the absence of a vaccine, as soon as we start releasing those physical distancing measures, we know that transmission will begin to pick up again. And so we are going to be in a position where we need to very critically use data to help us assess when we need to re-implement different types of public health measures in order to keep transmission low until we have a vaccine.
Thanks very much, Amy. Rozita, I'll turn to you now. You're an expert in the use of technology in the agri-food sector and society more generally. Can I ask you, are there specific examples of technology we are using or should be using right now to support an agri-food sector that's clearly under a lot of pressure?
So thank you very much, Jeff. I believe this pandemic will spark agility in digital agriculture as it has re-emphasized the need to get access to some of the technology that exists in other sectors. And they are not easily accessible in agri-food systems. So this technology span from kind of simple requirements such as access to machine-readable data, which is not that much of an extraordinary technology, but not all sectors in agri-food or small-scale farms or businesses have access to such technologies. Also, it emphasizes the need for platforms that can manage data, and also more need for automation to be used for throughout the food supply chain. So these technologies, so what I expect to see that post-COVID will be a world with a lot more digital technology in the agri-food system for food production, distribution, safety, traceability. So some of the simple examples are, for example, physical distancing requirement. We require, again, access to software tools that can collect data automatically rather than using paper-based processes. We will see increase in use of robots, drones, and machine learning, and cutting-edge sensors to collect data and make decisions based on them. So in China, the use of drone technologies in farm have skyrocketed just because they want to make decision, maybe increase crop area without having enough labor. Even I mean, despite having challenges in having labor, access to labor. Other technologies that I would see that there will be increase are e-commerce tools, because small scale farmers now are showing resilience to sell and provide food to the community, and they have turned into social media outlets and they're selling their product that way. But I have to also mention that these technologies, many of them are in the pilot stage, meaning that they haven't been widely deployed or tested. So one of the changes that I will see, culture changes that hopefully I will see in digital agriculture world, is deploying these technologies in the real world environment to test them at a large scale, and also engage the end user who are making those tools and will be making decisions with those tools. So that's one of the changes that I expect to see in the culture and how we are using and developing these tools. The other change that I expect to see is kind of having platform approach to digital agriculture. As you can imagine, our digital world has become decentralized these days, and we need connected platform. That doesn't mean a centralized platform, but connected platform with standardization on data and software and system that we can integrate such systems. We need a pipeline for safe data management, sharing, and security. We need better way to identify people digitally. This is a technology that is missing in almost all sectors, because without identifying in a secure way identity of a farmer or somebody who is in the food supply chain, we cannot provide them service. So there are, I would expect there will be need for new platforms, legislation, and to enable this whole digital ecosystem to work efficiently and properly. But in terms of specific examples, again, as I mentioned, the use of automation tools, robotics in farms, and throughout the supply chain, there would be inevitable. I mean, there will be more of those tools. Another example, even for using contact tracing tools, even for agri-food workers, because as you know, one of the biggest outbreaks in Canada occurred in a meat processing plant, and we can use those tools to make the workers safe and also make sure that they comply with social distancing. So opportunities are enormous. There are lots that can be done with technology for future outbreaks, but we have to start working now, and we have to start to build that ecosystem.
Thanks, Rozita. That sounds like an exciting future. But the uptake of technology such as this, especially technology that involves tracing and sensing of individuals, it's sort of been unevenly taken up internationally. Some countries perhaps have embraced it before we have. Are there some real obstacles there in terms of privacy and the ethical use of data that we need to overcome as a country before we use some of these technologies?
For contact tracing, obviously, because we will be tracing individual and their most sensitive information, such as location and their identity, obviously it's quite sensitive data. Many countries, they have, for example, for South Korea, they have deployed such system, and there were lots of controversies around it because apparently that data was public for people to be aware, where some individuals visited, and although their name wasn't published, they became identifiable. But there are better, basically privacy has evolved. There are many best practices that are out there, such as privacy by design and other practices that if such tools are going to be implemented and deployed, they can take, practitioners, they can use to embed those the principles in the system and into processes and in terms of how they use that data, and to ensure privacy. So there has been some success stories. Apple and I believe Google, they're working with different governments. They are working with EU, they are working with the US government in terms of building a tool that doesn't collect highly sensitive data, but at the same time enables traceability, tracing infected individuals, and also, so they are, again, they're not using, they're not collecting highly sensitive data. So there are solutions out there, how we can, so one thing we have to consider about these technologies is that they cannot be we cannot expect that to leapfrog them into the workflow. We have to integrate them into the workflow. And so this is something that I think requires a kind of multidisciplinary effort that for policymakers, technology experts, epidemiologists, healthcare providers, we all need to sit together and look at not only privacy, because privacy seems to me as very simple, one component of this entire kind of ethical aspect of using such tools. And privacy is a little tiny thing, which is very important, but it's not the only thing. I think it's important for all of us to sit together and decide about other harmful use of this data and make sure that we will avoid it and kind of embed it into the workflow of the healthcare, basically.
Great, thanks, Rozita. It sounds like this emergency may well be the catalyst for getting everyone together to talk a little more deeply around this role of data and sensing and tracing. So thank you for that. Alfons, I'd like to turn to you now. Your area of expertise is agricultural economics. And I'd like you in particular to comment on how resilient our food systems have been under this current pressure that it's feeling. What do the data you work with tell us about how this pandemic has affected food systems, and particularly labor and workplaces that a number of our food processing facilities have been struck very heavily with this pandemic. Can you comment on any of that, please?
Yeah, first of all, Jeff, I'd just like to maybe just echo one point that Amy had brought up, and that's the scientific community response and the ability of data to respond very quickly, and how I think this pandemic has changed the nature in which we as scientists respond. A typical article has to go through a review process, and the economics profession has a terrible reputation for the length of time before an article is submitted, before it appears in print. But just to give a little plug to our profession, agricultural economics, the Canadian Journal of Agricultural Economics had a special issue on this, and it was put out in 3 weeks' time. The editors, Alan Kerr and from Guelph and Ryan Cardwell from Manitoba, got people together, said this is the deadline. It's not going to be traditional, but it went through a quick review process and very well received. And another, I think, outcome of that is the nature which we respond to these questions is through blogs and posts that are picked up. So as an aside, you talked about the resiliency. A number of us have commented on this through, I guess, non-traditional approaches that is due to the digitalization. So the food system and the resiliency of it has been bent but not broken, and I think that says a lot about our food system. What does initially, why did it bend is because the sudden change in the nature of the demand away from hospitality to the retail sector, and that meant that the whole system had to change in terms of the nature of the goods. We weren't selling little slices of butter or big tubs of butter to the hospitality sector. Now we were selling those 1 pound containers of butter, and so that nature of demand. In terms of what it might mean as we move forward, Jeff, I think that this trend of digitalization and automation is going to be enhanced because of this trend. Rozita has provided you a number of examples, but why is that going to occur? I think that farmers, for example, as we move through the supply chain from up to down, that farmers are going to be looking to ways to save on labor. They have for years. It's not a new trend, but I think this is just going to accelerate that movement to robotic milkers, to automatic picker of whatever crop or output it might be. So there's less reliance on labor. Moving forward, you've mentioned the processing sector, and that's the bottleneck in the system. There are, we've got all this farm product coming into a few major packers or processors, and then it funnels back out through the system, and that's the bottleneck. And if they have labor issues, in this case the health of the labor, then it shuts down, and we have implications that both at the farm level in terms of lower prices and potential shortages as we move forward. And then moving on, that I think that there is going to be issues at the retail, or the trends that we see at the retail level in terms of online purchase. I think we will continue to see afterwards. And in fact, I think things like moving away from going from the warehouse to the grocery store to the consumer, that we might just skip that grocery store. Why not go from the warehouse directly to the consumer? So all in all, I think that we've seen a system that has bent but not broken. It will continue to be challenged as we deal with the remaining period of this pandemic. But I think it's a tribute to the resiliency of it.
Well, thanks, Alfons. So it sounds like once this is all said and done, we won't really be back to where we were before, but there might be some significant systemic changes in the way food travels through society. Is that your feeling?
I think in a couple ways. I think that there might be a trend towards more local and more self-reliance, and so that's going to change the production system. there's going to be demands for that. Rozita mentioned some of the traceability technology. I think consumers are going to want to know more, not only how their food is produced, but where it's coming from, and likely support that that demand for that attribute. And then, as you move forward, there'll be more information on what consumers want, and the movement towards online purchase and delivery of food, I think, will continue. And it'll be interesting to see what happens to the hospitality sector after all of this. How will the services that they provide go back to normal? Will the extent of in-person service decline? Will we see things like ghost kitchens? That these restaurants have a kitchen that delivers, but they don't have any in-house. And data, the digitalization, the automation process will allow that process to happen.
Thank you. There's a lot to think about and unpack there, and which is a great segue actually to Simon, who's Simon. You're in the business of food, and certainly like to hear your opinion. What do the data that you work with tell you about how this pandemic has affected the business of food? Sort of following on from what Alfons said, and in particular, food prices and accessibility, and how does that sort of speak after the pandemic to what this landscape will look like?
So yeah, thank you, Jeff. My area of research is food supply chains and food consumer behavior, and the interesting thing is that most of the data that I work with is qualitative. It's words, it's phrases, it's meanings, it's understanding. It's not necessarily numbers. But I do a lot of work that does cross into the quantitative the quantitative area. So I'll talk across those two. I think there's two sort of related points to what Alfons was talking about, and just general food supply chain issues that are related to pandemics and what we're currently seeing. So we've seen during the pandemic the evidence of the way that the grocery system works. We've seen discussions about the just-in-time inventory management system that grocers use, where grocers have data about demand and they then give that data further up the supply chain to their suppliers so they can rapidly replenish stocks based on that demand. And during the early days of the pandemic, we saw outages and we saw all that panic buying, and the just-in-time system was sort of blamed by some commentators out there for those shortages, which I think is a bit wrong. The system is far more efficient because of just-in-time, and there's been discussions about, well, okay, rather than just-in-time systems, let's have more inventory at various points in the supply chain. But higher inventories at wholesale and in distribution centers won't mean that you get more food on shelves. The most important factor is trucks. It's the logistics, it's the movement of product into stores. And as an example, the Ford government in Ontario moved very quickly in mid-March to allow 24-hour-a-day deliveries to stores. And that allowed for rapid replenishment so that these outages for most products were short rather than long. So the data that the grocery stores had about demand and their logistics system allowed them and the Retail Council of Canada to lobby the government to allow them to deliver 24 hours a day. So I think it's a good example of data allowing for decision making. Another example, sort of related to the pandemic, is food contamination. And for the last number of years, we've been talking about blockchain and blockchain technology and how it allows sort of greater traceability in the food supply chain, which is, it's more data, and the data can be helpful. But blockchain doesn't solve the problem. The problem is, say, for example, food contamination. It allows us to understand where the contamination might be happening in the food supply chain, but it comes down to how rapidly government, other food safety enforcers can make those public announcements, those recalls. And so it's really the value of the data and the information is how quickly it's being used. So I think data has been important during the pandemic. It has value. but it has value in how it's interpreted. As a qualitative researcher, I'm always thinking, well, what does it mean? You know, what's the purpose of it, rather than what is the number itself? So the other angle to this is, when it comes to data in the supply chain and the pandemic, is cost. Food is a low margin product. The more technology you put into the food system, and technology generally means systems, and systems mean costs. So you've got to then recoup the cost from somewhere else. Consumers want food that is lower and lower in cost, or even though in Canada we spend somewhere 8-9% of our basic income on food. So yeah, the system has bent a bit, and to follow on what Alfons has said, it hasn't broken, but data has helped.
Right. Thank you, Simon. Yeah, you're right. Canadians are used to a very efficient and low-cost food system. What of what we're going through now and the things that you've mentioned, what do you predict will be a permanent change as a result of this experience, either on the consumer side or on the food value chain?
I actually will disagree a little bit from Alfons in that I don't think we'll see a major change. I think what drives the food supply chain is consumers. And we all recognize that there's no such thing as a consumer of food in Canada. There's all these different consumers with different needs and wants and behaviors. And we, as researchers, group them and study them. But there is two trends across all consumers in the marketplace, and that is convenience and price. And if you look at any place you buy food now, it revolves around those two concepts. So people have cost pressures, incomes are relatively stable and not increasing. If anything, that's going to get even more under tight pressure because people are losing their jobs because of the pandemic. Mortgages are high, the cost of living is high, but wages aren't increasing. So if anything, this pushes more people into the industrial food system that allows them to access food every day of the year at low price from all year around the world. And think about the quality of nutrition that we get from a grocery store system that allows us to get everything at one place. People want convenience, and I've sort of related that back to one place mentality, and that I can go to one store and I can get the meat, vegetables, bakery items, seafood, all my toilet cleaner, everything in one place. So I don't think those are going to change post-COVID. Now, I also do work in food prices, and we release the food price report each year, and we've released a COVID-19 update to the food price report in mid-March. We, in 1 week, managed to scramble together a report based on the machine learning work that colleagues in the School of Engineering, particularly Graham Taylor and Ethan Jackson, have been doing. And we predicted that food prices are going to be relatively what we expected from our initial 2020 prediction back in December 2019. But what we have found since then is this pandemic has created this, what I call a cyclone of data. Things are changing so rapidly from 24 hours to 48 hours. You know, 3 weeks ago, we didn't really have issues of, say, dumping potatoes or closing of processing plants, or the flour baking craze. Now everyone's at home baking bread, and all these factors, including the farm labor shortages, impact food prices. So really on the, really set back a little bit because the data has to come in quickly, and we just don't have mechanisms to get it. A lot of our food price report data comes from our areas outside of Canada because we find that data to be more accurate, and Stats Canada data for most of the food prices comes out once a month, and it'll be sort of another month or so before we see the real impact on food prices in Canada. So yeah, we're in this whirlwind situation of data coming at us from everywhere. The system of food has really been exposed to ordinary people, and through various things that I've discussed before. So it's an interesting time.
Thank you. That's great. I have sort of a final question for all of you that I'd like each of you to answer. Many of you have mentioned while you've been talking of the need either for changes in behaviors, change in regulation, changes in attitudes. perhaps more work that needed to be done in certain areas. And maybe I'll go in reverse and just ask you to continue on, Simon, because you did talk to that a little bit. What would be your message either to the food sector or to regulators or any other stakeholders to try and improve the resilience of our food system? You talked it up pretty good there, and I think you're right. We have been shown to be quite resilient, but are there things that, work that is yet to be done that's being demonstrated from this emergency?
Well, I think at its high level, we've realized that, data is important. It can help, but it needs to be accessible. It needs to be analyzable. It needs to be accurate. And I think that really important factor is that the cost of doing all that has to be low. We're not selling Rolex watches. We're not selling Mercedes-Benzes or Ferraris. We're selling food which makes sense on the dollar. So all these factors impact our ability to use data. Now, as a message to the food sector, I think the food sector is one that is highly resilient as it is. It deals with perishable products. It's used to having to change quickly, be agile, be adaptable to what's thrown at them. And this has meant that they've been doing a lot better than, say, the automotive sector, which had to shut down all and is starting to come back to some extent. But there are other examples. So I think learning and understanding the cost of data are probably two big things.
Great, thank you. Working backwards through our speakers, Alfons, do you have a message for the food or ag sectors or regulators that you'd like to give at the moment to improve the resilience or the performance or the efficiency of our systems, especially under moments of emergency such as we're seeing now?
So, yeah, I think we're going to have another shock to the system. And after this one is through, we can look back and try to assess what were the data points that we needed to really understand how to better adapt to the shock. And because agriculture is a biological process. It's not as easy to control as other sectors, and so and we're more vulnerable to those natural shocks that might occur either to a disease or weather, and so understanding what could we have done differently to move forward, and I think what sort of data that we can collect. One of the things we haven't mentioned is that there's just lots and lots of data. Sometimes there's just too much, and we're overwhelmed with the volume of data. And we can't amalgamate that data and make decisions from it. So what is it, the data that we really need to be able to collect to deal with a future shock to the system, such as COVID?
Good, excellent, thank you. Rozita, do you have some further comments on this? Is there a message? I think your message was one, perhaps, of a need for interdisciplinary work to try and bring all the stakeholders together. Could you expand on that?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I agree with Simon and Alfons about data part. So what the situation we have lots of data. We are overwhelmed with data, and I think there was an estimation in 2014 that there was only 1% of data were being used at that time, and by 2020 only 13%, and that's across all sectors. So what governments or ag practitioners need to do, starting with governments, I think they need to understand that we need new infrastructure. And new infrastructure includes wires and servers, of course, but it also requires some new technologies that it's not just a technology piece, because identity management technology pieces existed for quite a long time, but it's just because it requires a legal framework around it. It needs, as you indicated, Jeff, it requires kind of a multidisciplinary and kind of multifaceted approach to address not only just the technology itself, but many other aspects that these technologies require to be able to deploy and use in a broad situation. So new infrastructure with the support of the government, as indicated, before, we are collecting lots of data, but this data is being collected without having consistent protocols. It is important to pay attention to standardization, so that and all system data platforms, so that we can integrate different platforms at the time of crisis like this, to be able to make more kind of a global or regional decision at the regional level that are more accurate. The other, perhaps something that needs to be considered is, aside from standardization, we talk about privacy a lot, but also there are other aspects, ethics, semantics of data. And also operationally bringing everybody on board, all the stakeholders, enabling trust and transparency between stakeholders. This is something that technology on its own cannot enable. It requires best practices, it requires policies, maybe new regulations and framework and kind of regulations and legal regimes, basically, to enable kind of trust and transparency among different stakeholders. So that's something else, another thing that needs to get done. Technology is only one piece that needs to be advanced, and I think that's the easy part. It's the governance aspect as a whole. It's a policy, it's different stakeholders, their roles, their responsibilities, a standardization of data platform, digital identity tracing, so that online we have a passport to declare our identity and they can trust our identity all together. And also one other kind of item I wanted to point out is digital literacy and digital awareness. So as technologists, we are aware of technology, and still we are not completely of the consequences, ethical consequences and legal consequences. And I think in many sectors, digital literacy and awareness is lacking. Perhaps some educational systems around data ownership or legal policies and agreements, which will enable trust when as well. Those are also very critical. So basically, it requires kind of a holistic approach, multifaceted, with many stakeholders on board to be able to have better systems that are accessible. But in my opinion, as a first step is to start small. We don't want to boil the ocean, and that could be responsibility of the government to identify the exact problem, because there are many problems that we may not be able to tackle right now. Find a problem and then start small and start kind of in an iterative way to address that and many other problems that, and after addressing one kind of in iteration, address more and deploy technology and processes and policies as we go on.
Thank you, Rozita. So it's a great take-home message that technology is good, but we need to get our governance structures in place first, right, before we can do anything else. So thank you for that. Amy, do you have anything to add in terms of a message to the public, to the consumers, or to government, or to your academic colleagues as to what we should learn and take away from this emergency?
So I think that if we're talking about the agri-food business side of things, I think there are a couple of things that are worth considering moving forward. One is that the Canadian Pandemic Influenza Plan is kind of the national document that we use to outline how we're going to respond when we are faced with a pandemic public health emergency. And that plan is flexible and adaptable, and it's been sufficiently flexible to be able to use it in our COVID-19 response. I think one of the challenges that we're faced with is that for businesses, while some businesses have had a pandemic preparedness plan as a part of their human resources arrangement, I think that we have perhaps underestimated the potential for emerging infectious diseases. I think we have planned based on scenarios that perhaps are on the lower end of the spectrum. And what this has demonstrated to us is that when we have an emerging infectious disease that's highly transmissible and no vaccine candidate in the pipeline, our only option for reducing transmission is to change our behavior very dramatically and very quickly. And I think that those are difficult things to implement for essential services like food production types of industries. And we see that with some of the outbreaks in processing plants. And so really thinking about moving forward, you know, how do we protect workers and people who are essential to the food that we eat, that we require for our families and our communities, and be prepared to be able to put that on the table to keep them safe as a way to protect the supply chain. And I think that's an area that really has surprised me over time, is just, you know, how dramatically this has impacted some businesses that are really critical and outside of the healthcare sector. And I think we maybe did not put enough focus on preparing as individual businesses for these types of possibilities. And I think, you know, University of Guelph is very much focused on One Health, so thinking about interactions between humans and animals and the environment. And I think, unfortunately, you know, we are at a period of time where the risk for emerging infectious diseases from animals into human populations that are novel, to which we do not have any immunity in the human population, that risk continues to increase. And so we need to really think about preparedness proactively moving forward, I think.
Great, that's a great way to finish up here, Amy. And I think food was certainly an important item and in the news a lot before the pandemic. I think it will continue to be, and probably interest in food and agri-food systems will be the topic for some time to come. I was gratified to hear our Deputy Prime Minister, Christopher Freeland, speak in a press conference fairly recently, talking about, you know, the question, do we need a food emergency plan nationally? So that shows that at the very highest levels, we're getting attention. You folks as thought leaders in your disciplines, I hope we can find, and I think our Food Institute has a role to facilitate this, a spot at the table to help government and the food sector adapt to this new reality and to be better prepared next time. Because we all know that next time, as tragic and difficult as this time has been, next time could be worse, especially if the pathogen set up in our domestic species, for instance, our food animal species as a reservoir. So thank you for your input. I appreciate all of your thoughts, and I think those who will tune into this panel discussion will find it you know, very interesting to hear from people who are at the absolute cutting edge of our response to this pandemic. Thank you very much.